He just wanted to withdraw money to help his grandson pay for college. Instead, this 80-year-old war hero was humiliated in front of an entire bank. But what happened 30 minutes later proved that sometimes justice comes when you least expect it. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe that service to this country has no expiration date, please like and subscribe. Because what happened to the man you're about to meet should never happen to anyone who has ever worn a uniform. His name was Robert Keene, or simply Bobby to those who knew him best. On this quiet Tuesday morning, he wasn't seeking attention, wasn't there to make a scene, show off his medals, or boast about long-forgotten battles. All he wanted was to withdraw a few $100s from an old account he hadn't touched in years, the same account where he had once deposited hazard pay from deployments to places the government still doesn't fully acknowledge. He entered the main doors of Summit Ridge National Bank like anyone else would, quietly, calmly, hat in hand. That hat, a black cap embroidered with gold lettering reading Korea Vietnam Veteran, had been carefully cleaned at home. His shirt was pressed, though the cuffs were already fraying, and in his coat pocket were a folded VA card, 2 tattered discharge papers, and a brass challenge coin whose edges had been worn smooth by time. He stood patiently in line, as men of his generation were accustomed to doing, as if waiting in line was still a sacred duty. But the moment he reached the counter, everything changed. The teller, perhaps in her mid-20s, blinked skeptically at the name on the account and raised an eyebrow. Bobby handed her his ID with slightly trembling hands, not from fear, not from weakness, but from the lasting effects of time and too many cold nights in places without names. "I'd just like to withdraw some money," he said politely. "This account is under Robert Keene. It's been a while." The teller smiled tightly, typed a few times, and paused. Something on the screen didn't match her expectations. She called over her supervisor. His name was Caden, slick haircut, tie too short, wearing the smile of a man who doesn't need words to insult you. He approached, glanced at Bobby's documents, then at Bobby himself, and laughed. Not a friendly laugh. "Are you sure this account belongs to you, sir?" he asked, drawing out the "sir" as if it were a joke. "This discharge paper looks like it was typed on a dinosaur." The teller giggled nervously. Bobby said nothing. He simply reached slowly and carefully into his coat and placed something on the counter. A brass challenge coin, engraved with a thunderbird and 7 stars. Something no civilian would recognize, but something that would make any real soldier hold their breath. Caden didn't even look at it. "Cute souvenir," he muttered. "You can buy those online nowadays." Then he turned to security and pointed toward the door. "I think we've got another wannabe veteran here trying to game the system. Please escort him out." The security guard hesitated for just a moment, but long enough for Bobby to hear every word, and for the rest of the bank to take notice. A few customers chuckled behind their phones. 1 or 2 pretended they heard nothing. Bobby didn't argue. He didn't demand anything. He simply picked up the coin, tucked it carefully back into his coat pocket, nodded once, and walked slowly toward a bench by the window. There he sat upright, hands folded, staring into space. The laughter died down and a strange silence settled over the bank lobby. Not remorse yet, but something cooler. Unease, as if people deep down suddenly weren't so sure. But one person wasn't laughing. Her name was Maya Rodriguez, early 30s, former Air Force logistics specialist, now working in the defense industry. She had seen a coin like that once before. Once when a retired JSC colonel briefed her team, and she remembered exactly how every officer in the room had stood up when he placed that coin on the table. She walked directly to the counter, looked the branch manager squarely in the eye, and said, "You just made a mistake." Caden blinked, confused. "Excuse me?" Maya pointed toward the bench. "That man is not a fraud. That coin alone is worth more than any paycheck in this building," Caden scoffed. "If he's so important, why isn't anyone with him?" Maya didn't answer. She simply stepped outside and made a phone call. But someone else had noticed too. In the back office, an older employee, one of those quiet veterans who held no titles but possessed all the knowledge, had accidentally overheard the name Robert Keene. He paused, then walked slowly to a corner of the room where a brass plaque hung on the wall. It had been mounted when the bank opened, dedicated to Summit Ridge Command Base and those who built it. Among the engraved names was one that had never faded: R.J. Keene, the man who had once overseen the original military infrastructure before the land was converted for civilian use. The same man who was now being accused of presenting fraudulent military identification in the very bank that existed because of his command. The employee said nothing. He picked up the phone, dialed a number only a handful of people knew by heart, and spoke just 6 words. "Bishop Coyne. Summit Ridge. He's here." Then he hung up. Outside, Bobby sat as still as stone. He didn't pull out his phone, didn't make a scene. He just watched the wind tug at the flag across the street and waited. Not for justice, not for recognition, but because men like him had always done. They wait until they're needed. They wait even when no one believes them. They wait while the world laughs. But what no one in that bank knew, not the branch manager, not the teller, not even Maya, was that in 30 minutes, that laughter would turn to silence. Because a few streets away, an angry general had already slammed his phone down on his desk, thrown on his dress uniform, and was on his way to ensure that the man everyone mocked and thought was a fraud would never be overlooked again. The next 20 minutes at Summit Ridge National Bank passed like molten syrup. Slow, heavy, uncomfortable, especially for those who had laughed just moments before. The teller who had giggled now kept her head down, pretending to type, while Caden, the branch manager, paced behind the counter, shooting nervous glances toward the front door, though he didn't yet know why. Bobby Keene hadn't moved. He sat exactly where they had told him to sit, as if it were just another waiting room in another government building, just another day in a long life of lines and cold stares. His hands rested on his walking cane, his shoulders straight, despite the age he never spoke of. And that challenge coin remained hidden, its significance as invisible to these people as his service. But the silence around him was different now. It was no longer the silence of dismissal, it was the silence of doubt. Maya Rodriguez watched him from across the lobby, arms crossed tightly, lips pressed in frustration. She had already made her call to a retired commander at Fort Brixton, who needed only to hear Bishop Coyne and Robert Keene before his tone completely changed. "You said he's there?" the voice had asked. "Don't let him leave." Maya didn't know what would happen next, but her gut told her something was already in motion. And she was right. 2 blocks away, a black SUV cut through traffic, flashing its lights just once to signal authority without invitation. Inside sat General Meyer Everett Kane, decorated, feared, and famous for his precision. Currently the regional operations commander for 4 military districts, and one of only 5 living men authorized to carry a bishop-level active reconnaissance clearance. When he received the call and heard the name Robert Keene, he stopped mid-briefing, stood from his chair, and said only 4 words to his aide. "Get dressed, we're leaving immediately." For Kane, Keene wasn't just a name in a file. Keene was the reason Kane wore the stars on his shoulders. A living ghost, a man assumed to have been long out of circulation. The kind of figure spoken of in hushed tones during strategy sessions and legacy briefings. Keene had trained under a doctrine that Kane had helped develop. The fact that he was being publicly humiliated in uniform, in a building that literally stood on ground he once commanded, ignited something in the general that he rarely showed: fury. Meanwhile, back at the bank, Bobby adjusted the sleeve of his coat, the quiet hum of fluorescent lights filling the air above him. But no one spoke. A customer near the coffee station left awkwardly without making his deposit. A security guard stood near the exit, shifting his weight nervously from foot to foot, casting furtive glances at the old man who had neither complained nor raised his voice, yet somehow radiated the kind of presence that made people accustomed to authority deeply uncomfortable. Caden tried to shake off his unease. "He's still here," he muttered, peering over the line of tellers. "Seriously, he's probably hoping someone will take a photo of this so he can crowdfund some sympathy online. Veterans pull this stuff all the time." Maya's jaw clenched, and the young woman at the counter looked down even further. Even she knew that had gone too far. Caden leaned smugly against the counter. "I should have called the police. It's only a matter of time before he causes a scene here." But just as the words left his mouth, the glass doors of the bank slammed open with force. Not from wind, not from a customer, but from command. A chill swept through the room. Real boots, not shoes, boots, struck the tiles with precision, neither hurried nor hesitant, but determined and controlled. Major General Meyer Everett Kane, in full dress uniform, every metal gleaming, every fabric crease razor-sharp, entered with a presence that filled the entire lobby before he spoke a single word. Behind him followed an aide, briefcase in one hand, serious and silent. No one moved. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Coffee cups paused halfway to mouths, and Caden, still leaning against the counter, looked up and froze, his smug grin dissolving into complete silence. Kane ignored everyone at first, his gaze fixed directly on the bench by the window where Bobby Keene still sat. And then, in front of the entire bank, the general snapped to attention and saluted. The sound of that gesture, the sharp slap of hand to temple, echoed louder through the room than any apology ever could. Bobby looked up, confused for just a moment, before slowly rising and returning the salute with the dignity of a man who hadn't received a salute in years, but had never forgotten how it's done. Then Kane turned slowly and let his gaze sweep through the room like a blade. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but sharp enough to cut glass. "Who here called Colonel Robert Keene a fraud?" he asked, each syllable forged from steel. No one answered at first. Kane stepped forward. "Colonel Keene," he repeated, emphasizing the rank clearly, "was instrumental in developing the joint reconnaissance operational protocols still used by Allied nations today. His deployment spans 2 wars, 6 operational theaters, and 14 unacknowledged operations. You questioned his identity." All eyes turned to Caden. The branch manager looked like he was going to be sick. I didn't know," Caden stammered. "His papers were old and—" "Of course they're old." Kane cut him off sharply. "Because he earned his age. He fought for this country, while your biggest challenge was learning how to schedule tweets." The silence in the room shifted again, from uncomfortable to humiliating. Kane's aide stepped forward and opened the briefcase. Inside, a thick folder marked classified, a commemorative coin set in sand, and a printed scan of that plaque on the bank's wall, where Robert Keene's name was boldly engraved. Kane placed the folder on the counter. "This bank exists because of his strategic design. The account you flagged as suspicious once funded the original supply lines you profit from today." He turned back to Bobby, this time with a softer tone. "Sir, I'm sorry. I didn't know you were already in town." Bobby nodded warily. "I didn't come here to be found. I just needed enough to help my grandson with college." Kane nodded slowly. "Then let's make sure that happens." And together, they approached the counter while Caden stepped back, hands raised in silent surrender. The laughter had long since died, and the lesson was just beginning. The silence at Summit Ridge National Bank was no longer uncomfortable. It was reverent. Everyone in that room had just witnessed something that felt like the ground itself had remembered what weight it once carried. General Meyer Everett Kane stood beside Colonel Robert Keene at the counter. Not barking orders, not demanding punishments, but simply standing there, as if nothing else in the world mattered, until this man got what he came for. Bobby lifted the money quietly, without ceremony, to help his grandson attend college, something he hadn't even mentioned until the general asked. He wanted no attention. He had never wanted it. All he had ever wanted was to keep his word to those he fought for and those he came home to. The teller's hands shook as she printed the receipt, and she whispered an apology that Bobby didn't acknowledge. Not out of spite. He simply didn't need it. He took the paper, folded it once, and put it in his pocket as if it were just another task completed. But as he turned to leave, General Kane stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. "Colonel," he said quietly, "you have 5 minutes." Bobby raised an eyebrow. "For what?" Kane nodded toward the room. "For the honor you never asked for." And then, without a single word of command, every veteran in the room rose. From a young reservist at the ATM to an old Navy corpsman filling out a deposit slip, they stood at attention and saluted. Even the civilians stood, not because anyone told them to, but because something in the air told them, this is how you honor a man like this. Bobby froze for a moment, not from pride, but from disbelief. Then he slowly returned the salute with quiet precision. Kane reached into his coat pocket and handed Bobby a small sandbox. "We've been keeping this for you all these years," he said. "Thought you might want it now." Inside lay a medal, clean and polished, engraved with just a name and 3 words: "Service Beyond Protocol." Bobby stared at it for a long time. No tears, no speech, just a slow nod as if he had finally closed a door that no one knew was still open. Then he looked at Kane and said quietly, "I didn't come here to be remembered, I came to keep a promise." Kane nodded back. "And in doing so, you showed us all what service really means." Bobby stepped out into the sunlight. No cameras followed him, no headlines appeared. But the people inside stood a little straighter, spoke a little quieter. Later that week, a new line was added to the plaque at the bank's entrance. Below the original dedication appeared a second inscription: "Robert J. Keene, Colonel, U.S. Army, honor in silence." It didn't mention the incident, didn't reference the general, but everyone who worked there knew. Because some truths don't need to be shouted to change everything. And now, every time a customer walks through those doors, they see the name of the man they almost laughed out of the building. Bobby left the bank, but the space he left behind remained filled with a silence that said more than any words. He didn't know what he had triggered, and he didn't want to know. For him, it was just another promise kept, another burden lifted from his shoulders. But for the people in the town and beyond, it was something that burned into their hearts like an unspoken oath. The days that followed were marked by an unexpected quiet. The people who had nearly laughed him away spoke softer, looked at each other more often, held doors open for strangers. Even Caden, who had felt shame like never before in his life, showed up the next day in his reserve uniform. Not because anyone told him to, but because he couldn't look at himself in the mirror without remembering the scene at the counter. General Kane stayed in town longer than he had planned. He knew Bobby wouldn't return. Men like Bobby don't leave traces in the form of monuments or street names. They leave people who are quieter, more thoughtful, more honest. Kane knew it was his duty to keep that quiet flame burning. And so he began visiting schools, meeting with veteran groups, young people who thought honor was something you could buy or display on social networks. But no one saw Bobby. No one knew where he had gone. It wasn't until months later that his traces were found again in a small remote community far from Summit Ridge. There he worked at an old cemetery, caring for forgotten graves, repairing fences, tending flowers. No one there knew who he was, and that's how he liked it. But the past catches up with everyone. One morning, a group of teenagers appeared at the cemetery. They were looking for a lost drone, and instead found Bobby. At first they laughed at the old man with rough hands and simple clothes, but when he began telling stories in a calm voice about the names on the tombstones, it became quiet. They came back every day. Not because they had to, but because they understood they were learning from someone who had seen more than they could imagine. Bobby never told stories about himself. He spoke of others, of the men and women whose names weathered in the wind, of promises given and kept across generations. And slowly the teenagers understood that this man who washed graves and spoke simple words was someone who fought a war inside himself that no one saw. In Summit Ridge, Bobby had become legend. No one knew exactly what had happened that day at the bank, but everyone talked about it. The bank had a simple sign made. Here, a man reminded us that true greatness needs no uniform. It was never vandalized, never painted over. It became a quiet monument. General Kane returned to the site years later. The place had grown. People had begun calling it Keene Square, though it was never officially approved. Kane smiled bitterly. Bobby would have hated that. He finally found out where Bobby was, and on a rainy autumn evening, he walked onto the small cemetery. Bobby sat under an old tree, looking out at the rows of quiet stones. "You left traces, Colonel," Kane said. Bobby shook his head. "No, General, I just fixed something that was broken." Kane sat beside him. For the first time in many years they sat side by side, not as officers, but as men who knew that some battles never end. "You inspired a young man to go to officer school," Kane said quietly. "Maybe he'll do better than we did." "Maybe," Bobby murmured. "Maybe." That night, Bobby died quietly, without fanfare, on that bench under the tree that had heard his stories. When Kane found him, his old hat lay neatly beside him, and in his hand he held a small crumpled note. On it was written, I didn't come to be remembered, I came to remember. His grandson found the cemetery years later, and when he recognized the tree, he sat under it just as his grandfather had done. He told stories, not of wars, not of medals, but of people, of promises, of honor that comes quietly and goes quietly. And somewhere in the world, on an old wooden table in a bank, a small dusty medal lay. No one took it, because it didn't belong to a man. It belonged to an idea. The story of Bobby Keene and the bank became more than local legend. It became a teaching tool in officer schools across the country, a reminder that true leadership often comes from the most unexpected places. His name appeared on no monuments, but it lived in the hearts of those who learned what it meant to serve without seeking glory. In that small cemetery where Bobby spent his final years, a simple marker was placed under the old tree. It bore no rank, no list of achievements, just his name and the words he had written on that final note. I didn't come to be remembered, I came to remember. And every Veterans Day, without fanfare or ceremony, someone places a single white flower there. Not for the cameras, not for recognition, but because some promises are kept forever, even when the one who made them is gone. The bank still operates, the plaque still hangs by the door, and sometimes new employees ask about the old medal on the back table. The older staff members just smile and say, "It belonged to someone who showed us what honor really looks like." And in officer training schools across the nation, instructors still tell the story of the man who was almost turned away from a bank. The general who reminded everyone of what respect means and the quiet dignity that can change hearts without saying a word. Because real heroes don't need monuments. They need people who remember their example and carry it forward. The question isn't whether Bobby Keene was a hero. The question is, what kind of person will you choose to be when you encounter someone whose worth isn't immediately obvious? As Maya Rodriguez, the former Air Force specialist who first recognized the truth, later said, "That day taught me that the most powerful people in the room are often the ones who speak the softest." Bobby's story reminds us that honor isn't about the uniform you wear or the medals on your chest. It's about how you treat others when no one is watching, how you keep your promises when it would be easier to break them, and how you maintain your dignity, even when the world has forgotten your worth. In a world quick to judge and slow to listen, Bobby Keene's story stands as a reminder that every person we meet carries battles we cannot see, and that sometimes the greatest honor we can give someone is simply to treat them with the respect they've earned through a lifetime of service, whether we know their story or not. His grandson, now a teacher, ends every Veterans Day lesson with his grandfather's words, "The most important fights aren't fought for glory. They're fought for the people who will never know your name." And perhaps that's the truest definition of heroism. Serving not for recognition, but because it's the right thing to do, and trusting that somewhere, somehow, someone will remember to honor those who came before. The bank still stands, the plaque still reads his name, and the lesson lives on. Never judge a person's worth by what you can see on the surface. Because sometimes the most extraordinary people look the most ordinary, and the greatest heroes are the ones who never asked to be called heroes at all. If this story moved you, remember to honor the veterans in your community. Their service doesn't end when they take off the uniform, and their worth doesn't diminish with age. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply listen to their stories and treat them with the respect they've earned.